So this is lesson 3 of Take Better Photos. And if you'll remember, we are going to make sure the first 4 lessons of this series are going to be applicable to any camera that you have. We're not going to get into a lot of technical things right now. No talk of shutter speed or aperture or off-camera lighting. I just want to make sure these are things that you keep in mind because you can really carry them from camera to camera, no matter what camera you're using. So today, to talk about composition, it's really not going to take that long because I'm going to only deal with some basics, things that are easy to remember, things that you can apply to your work right now, and they will make a huge difference. This, along with knowing how to crop and maybe some editing techniques, are really going to take you a long way. Now, this doesn't change the fact that you need to understand lighting, but we are going to cover lighting in depth further along. But right now, and composition too, there are a lot of things that we really can't cover at this point with composition just because they involve some technical things. So let's get started with some very basic ideas about composition so that you can see how this is going to make a difference in your photography. So yeah, composition, as I mentioned, is a big deal when it comes to any type of visual art. It's a very powerful way to isolate your subject, communicate and convey emotion, create visual impact, and present a common subject in a very uncommon way. For example, if there's a rose that you want to take a picture of and it's beautiful, you want to make sure that the way you shoot that rose looks very different maybe from the way someone else has done it, or maybe even the way you've done it before. So composition and compositional elements techniques are ways that we can do that, and the more we learn about these techniques and the more we actually apply them to the images that we're taking, the more we see the difference that it makes. So as I've mentioned already, this is not a comprehensive lesson. These are just some basics. One of the very basic things about composition is something called the rule of thirds. It's been around really forever. It's not anything that photographers created. In fact, it's way back in the art world that people began to notice something about how they were drawn to things that were maybe on the third of a frame. This is something that occurs not just in art, but in nature as well. And if you do a little research on it, it won't take you long to see there is a connection between natural things in our created world and things that we create. So let's talk about that in a little more depth. Looking at the rule of thirds grid here, it's not hard to see why it's called that. Everything is sectioned off by thirds. Third of the way down, third of the way to the top, and then on the right and the left, same thing. And we notice that they intersect. This is very much like a tic-tac-toe board. Anytime you place your subject on one of these lines that's on the third, you are actually making your image stronger. Now, if you think about a horizon line or a landscape, if you were to put your horizon line down here and have this beautiful sunset going on right here, it's going to be stronger than if you put your horizon line straight through the middle. When it comes to any other type of thing, well, it doesn't have to be, and it can be a landscape as well. But if you look at these intersection points, these are also places that things are going to be, if we place them here, it will bring a lot of strength and impact to the image. The same goes for these corners here. So think about that. If we try to avoid things in the middle, even though there are going to be times to break that rule, we're going to have a stronger image right off the bat. Let me make it clear that it is not wrong to put things in the middle of your image. Sometimes that's exactly what you want to do, and you really want the force of the impact to come from that being the only thing in the image, and sometimes just putting it dead center really brings a lot of attention to that. However, by and large, you're going to notice in any type of design, whether it's graphic design or sculpture or even architectural design, you'll see this rule of thirds
repeated over and over and over again because it is a very strong design element. And composition really means that you are designing your image. It takes a lot of purpose, a lot of intent for you to design your image the way you want it to be. Sometimes that's not possible if you're shooting candidly and you're trying just to grab shots on the fly. You don't always have control over where things are happening, but you do have control a lot of times on where you place yourself and how you crop those images later. We will talk about cropping, just not in this lesson.
So let's look at this first set of images, giving us an idea of what the rule of thirds looks like, well, in an image. This is our horizontal, our landscape orientation with our subject coming, or at least, her head and her face right here on this third. If you were to imagine those lines that I just showed you, you would see that her eyes and her face come right about that point where those thirds intersect. There is another element here that you can use. We're not really going to talk about it in depth, but we have an implied diagonal here as well, which is another very strong compositional element. Here's how the rule of thirds looks in a vertical image. And you can almost imagine thirds because of the vertical, these trees here and how they are lining up along the third. But to have our subject right here on this line makes this image a little stronger than if we had her dead center. Now, she does have a tree behind her, and we have to be very careful of objects behind our subjects, but imagine if she were here, how she would basically be competing with this tree rather than here, we see a complement.
We're definitely going to talk about background too later and what the things that you need to kind of clean up out of the background and cropping and all of that. Kind of keep that in mind as you're going through these composition images that you're going to shoot. Just be aware of what's in the background. Try to keep it as clean as possible, but don't let that be more important at this point than learning these compositional techniques. We're going to look at a couple more, and you are going to have an assignment that involves all four of them.
So in addition to our rule of thirds, let's talk about leading lines. Leading lines sometimes can actually be real lines, as we see in this image. Sometimes they can be implied lines, like here. We don't necessarily see the lines as clearly or as strongly in this image on the vertical that we do over here in this horizontal, but we definitely see the implication, and we see that they are pointing right to her eyes, right to her face. Now these leading lines, of course, bring us to our subject, and if you'll notice, he's on the third. You might also notice that there are some leading lines or framing type things here. And that brings us to another idea, which is framing. So framing is when we actually put our subject within a natural frame, or naturally occurring frame, I should say. This was a natural occurrence. These are ruins, church ruins, and it was very easy to make ask my bride to stand here so that we frame her with what's behind her and what's beside her. Now, these frames that I used were more symmetrical, and that was by design. Again, these are decisions that I'm making intentionally. They're not by accident, but you see these lines here framing in our subject on this horizontal image. Now, there's also leading lines here. You can't deny that these are all leading to him. But because of the symmetry, this is also a great example of framing. Framing does not have to be symmetrical. It can also be asymmetrical. So we see that in the case of our leaves here that are surrounding Newell's face. We have framed him in with those leaves, but we're not worried about making everything straight. And over here with Catherine, again, we have framed her in, but the image itself doesn't carry symmetrical framing. That's okay. As long as our subject is framed in some way with something, we are using framing as compositional technique.
There you have it. It's not too hard when you think about it, and that's only 4 different techniques. There are so many techniques, so many ways to compose your image, but the real thing I want you to take away from this is that it involves intention. You really need to think about what you're doing and where you're positioning your subject within the frame. Now, I do use a lot of portrait work. That's what I do, and I've mentioned that before, but these same principles, if you go out and there's a beautiful flower in your yard, or I don't know, maybe something, maybe your house even. If you want to take pictures of landscapes or structures, that's perfectly fine. Please don't feel that you have to use these compositional techniques just with portraits. They apply to everything. But you do have some homework to do to show me that you know what you've got here and how you're figuring it out, or how this is all working for you.
So, numbers 1 and 2, you're going to shoot using those different compositional techniques that we just talked about. You're more than free to roll back through this video if you need to. Make sure that you are using the same subject with number 1, and then you can use a different subject for number 2, but consistent throughout those 2 assignments. You're going to use 2 compositional techniques in number 2. And just as a reminder, we've done that in several of these images. Down in the bottom third here, making sure we're using rule of thirds along with framing. And this is almost a rule of thirds because of where his body is situated, along with framing. There's a lot of symmetry going on right there, but rule of thirds here. So we definitely were using or thinking, I was definitely thinking about those things when I was composing these images. Same thing here. The top third is where we have her face. So you can definitely try that. In fact, I want you to try that. And you're really going to have to think through those things.
So once you're done, and you will have, if you decide to do the bonus, which is another image with 2 different, sorry, 1 compositional technique and some backlighting. Make sure to put those in the Google photo album and make sure your name is on them. Make sure I know what compositional technique that you're showing me. And if you have questions, you will drop those in the comment section of the Facebook group where I post this link. And the main thing I want you to do is have fun with this. This is a time for you to get creative, and I really do want you to give me more than just, yeah, I know what you're talking about. Don't just snap through a bunch of pictures and say, yeah, okay, that works. Really think about what you're doing, because it is the development and the discipline of intent that's going to make all of your pictures better. All right, y'all go out there and shoot. I know you can't get too far if you're like us. We're kind of locked in right now. Do the best you can. I'm looking forward to seeing what you post.